Welcome back to CIA Declassified. In the ongoing saga of Project MKUltra, we've witnessed attempts to control the mind by making it blank. Subproject 130 tried to achieve a tabula rasa through environmental void and chemical dissolution. But for the operational minds at the CIA, this process was too slow, too resource-intensive, and frankly, too subtle. Their analysis concluded that for a rapid, irreversible psychological breakdown, they needed to utilize the brain's own defense mechanisms against it. If the mind's architecture couldn't be dissolved, it would have to be shattered. This necessity gave rise to one of the most physically and psychologically damaging projects in the entire MKUltra catalog, Subproject 88, internally codenamed the Shock Protocol. This project was a focused, systematic effort to weaponize trauma itself using technology borrowed directly from the psychiatric ward, specifically high-voltage electroconvulsive therapy. This week, we peel back the layers of medical pretext to expose the deliberate infliction of catastrophic psychological harm. The central principle guiding Subproject 88 was the reliable induction of amnesia. In clinical psychiatry, ECT is used with controlled parameters and muscle relaxants. The CIA stripped away all controls. The goal was not therapy, but targeted memory sabotage. When a person experiences a traumatic event, the memory is laid down initially in short-term storage. Over the following hours and days, a period called the consolidation phase, the memory is chemically and structurally stabilized in the brain's long-term systems, heavily linked with emotional context by the amygdala. The doctors of the shock protocol learned to interrupt this. They administered a high-voltage electrical current strong enough to induce a grand mal seizure at precisely the moment a subject was being exposed to a psychologically devastating scenario, or immediately afterward. The critical post-traumatic window. The project documents refer frequently to the critical post-traumatic window, or CPTW. This was the narrow time frame, estimated at less than 60 minutes, where the neural circuits were most volatile and vulnerable. Applying ECT during this window was intended to overwrite the consolidation process entirely. The result was a memory trace that was violently disrupted. The feeling of terror remained, but the subject lost the ability to recall the context, the who, and the why. The trauma became a floating, free associating anchor of fear that could not be rationalized, defended against, or even articulated. The self was compromised not by erasure, but by unstable, untraceable terror. To maximize the efficacy of the shock, Subproject 88 protocols mandated a synergistic application of debilitating chemical agents. The drugs were used to make the subject physically incapable of resisting and mentally unable to process reality. The most common drug used was the fast-acting barbiturate sodium pentothal. 1. Chemical restraint. Subjects were given intravenous doses of that, inducing a state of sleep, twilight sedation. The subject was technically conscious, could hear, and could feel, but was physically paralyzed or extremely lethargic, unable to move or vocally resist. The uncontested shock. The ECT was then administered. The terror of the shock, the massive seizure, the involuntary muscle spasms, was experienced in a state of horrific, paralyzed helplessness. The psychological effect of experiencing uncontrolled physical violation while entirely unable to move was considered a major component of the trauma protocol. And 3. The stimulant reversal. Immediately following the shock, fast-acting stimulants were often used to pull the subject abruptly out of sedation. This rapid transition from deep unconsciousness to hyper-alert panic was intended to further destabilize the cognitive state, preventing the brain from achieving any stability or baseline reality. The combination of the drug and the current was designed to eliminate the subject's agency, the sense of having control over one's own body and fate, making them utterly dependent on the experimenters for the restoration of any sensation of safety or reality. The files pertaining to the shock protocol are among the most heavily redacted in the entire MKUltra archive. The black ink is not random, it is highly strategic, covering 3 consistent and damning categories of information. 1. The location and infrastructure of the experiments. What is redacted? The specific names and geographic locations of the hospitals, university basements, military installations, and remote safe houses where the high voltage procedures were carried out. This includes the building names, room numbers, and specific model numbers of the ECT machines utilized. Hypothesis for this redaction: protecting the domestic operational base. If the CIA revealed that a specific reputable teaching hospital or a major university clinic was a clandestine operational site for this project, the institution would face an immediate, massive, and undeniable legal and public relations catastrophe. Redacting this information protects the ability of the CIA to use domestic institutional infrastructure as fronts for future covert programs, ensuring that the network of complicity remains invisible. 2. The identity and credentials of the clinical personnel. What is redacted? The names, medical license numbers, and professional organization affiliations of the supervising psychiatrist, technicians, and nurses who performed the ECT. The documents are meticulous and blacking out any information that would allow one to trace the identity of the white coat operators. Hypothesis for redaction: preventing legal accountability and professional ruin. Unlike the high-profile scientists involved in some of the other projects, these individuals were often lower to mid-level medical staff whose direct participation in physically administering the shocks made them legally vulnerable to charges of assault, battery, and medical malpractice. The redaction shields them from civil lawsuits and criminal prosecution, ensuring the CIA's network of operational staff, people willing to cross ethical lines, are protected from professional consequences. And 3, the details of repeated trauma and long-term institutionalization. What is redacted? Precise figures on the number of shocks administered per subject, the total duration of the experimental cycle, and the final disposition reports. Phrases like, quote, permanent care required, end quote, incapable of self-management, end quote, and, quote, transfer to long-term care facility X, end quote, are consistently obscured. Hypothesis for redaction: hiding the irreversible human cost. The most damaging secret of Subproject 88 was not that it failed, but that its success resulted in permanent, irreparable psychological damage. The repeated trauma led directly to states of prolonged catatonia and severe permanent psychosis. Revealing the true scope of these permanent injuries and the taxpayer funds used to institutionalize these broken subjects would have generated immediate congressional and public outcry confirming the criminal nature of the experiment. The shock protocol, aka Subproject 88 of MKUltra, proved a disturbing truth. The CIA was capable of inflicting the deepest kind of trauma, but incapable of controlling the outcome. The program was not terminated because the doctors grew a conscience, but because the results were operationally useless. The subjects were rendered so fragmented and severely traumatized that they could not be reliably re-encoded. They were more likely to suffer a total breakdown on a mission than to follow their programming. They had achieved over-destruction. The documents of the shock protocol stand as evidence that when the CIA sought speed and violence, they found only permanent ruin. The human mind is not a machine that can be factory reset by a controlled short circuit. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the true cost of weaponized trauma. Next, we're going to turn our attention away from the physical shock and chemical oblivion and focus on the power of suggestion under duress. We will analyze the dark promise of MKUltra's Subproject 21, the sleep deprivation interrogation. We look at the chilling combination of prolonged sensory stress, often involving days without sleep, loud white noise, and constant light, coupled with targeted programmed messages. We analyze the attempts to create the perfect hypnotic courier, compelled to carry out complex missions, remember nothing of the instruction, and respond only to highly specific post-hypnotic trigger phases. Join us next time for CIA Declassified, MKUltra Subproject 21, the sleep deprivation interrogation. Until then, understand the depth of the shadow government, maintain your vigilance, and keep your critical thinking sharp. I'll see you in the archives.